Yes, thank you, Alicia, and thank you to all the speakers and listeners for participating. I've been with Incomindios Switzerland for over 2 years now, and I'm really looking forward to this event because it's the first official event of Incomindios UK. As Alicia already said, Incomindios is originally a Swiss human rights organization which advocates for indigenous and environmental rights with a focus on North and Latin America. We were founded in 1974 on the initiative of indigenous delegates who were coming to the UN, and supporting indigenous delegates and their missions at the UN is still one of the core areas of Incomindios Switzerland. And since 2003, we also have the consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, which directly allows us and the delegates we support to participate at the UN. And with our scholarship programs, we particularly focus on supporting Indigenous youth as the future leaders of their communities, well, either at the UN or with their studies. And I'm really excited that two of our scholarship recipients, Cassandra and Brittany, will be introducing themselves later. And finally, besides the collaboration with Indigenous delegates, we also support local Indigenous projects which aim at the protection of Indigenous rights and the environment. And we work to inform the Swiss and, well, now also the British public about Indigenous issues, human rights violations, and just generally work to build bridges between Indigenous movements and the Swiss and European civil society. So thank you again for being here, and I pass the mic back to Alicia.
Thanks, Barbara. Thank you again all so much for joining. Your presence here shows your care and interest in this topic. And we ask that you help spread the word if you're not already spreading the word and shine more light on this. Today we come together to talk about this most pressing urgent issue, which is severely overlooked and ignored by mainstream media and the general public, but persists in being an epidemic of violence and injustice on unspeakable levels. What we are talking about is, as you know, MMIWG, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. While this impacts Indigenous peoples globally, we have a specific focus on Indigenous peoples in the Americas. So in Canada, it's been called a national crisis and genocide. The national inquiry into MMIWG was launched in September 2016 in Canada, as Indigenous women and girls represented 16% of all female homicides in Canada, while representing 4% of the entire female population of the country. Additionally, in the US, Native American women are twice than likely to experience violence than any other demographic. It's a hugely overrepresentation of violence, and this is inseparable, deeply entrenched links to institutional cycles of oppression that stem from colonial and post-colonial systems. We're going to dive much deeper into this, as we are really honored to have a fantastic panel here today. Strong women speaking out, like Leandra Nephin from the Omaha community, who will share insight into this issue centralized in the US. Cassandra Spade, who is an Anishinaabe youth advocate and activist in Canada, who will share about culture and language loss associated with this problem, and also the impacts on the Indigenous youth community in Canada. Claudia Claros is a Bolivian human rights lawyer, and she will speak on this issue during armed conflicts in South America. Leandra and Claudia are also on the board of Incomindios UK, and Cassandra Spade was our 2019 Incomindios UN Youth Delegate to the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Just a word, we originally had advertised that one of our featured speakers was going to be Mushkegowuk elder and author Vivian Timmons. However, most unfortunately, she is currently dealing with a personal matter, so she will not be able to participate, but we send our best wishes and prayers to her at this time. And we also want to honor her because she's been doing incredible work with all things MMIWG in Canada. And it's also because of her we know Cassandra Spade. So I'm going to pass the mic on to them soon, but just before I do, I want to address a couple items. We will have a question and answer period at the end of this session. However, we'd ask, just out of respect for our speakers, that you write your question into the chat box to everyone, which this is located on the, when you click on more at the bottom of your screen, the chat box should come up and you can put it in the chat box to everyone. This will be collected by members of our team and addressed at the end of the session, and which will be moderated by Leandra and assisted by Jacob and Danny. If you have a question directly to one of the panelists, please include that. And we'd also ask, I think most of you have already done this, but so thank you for muting your microphone just to help so that everyone can hear our speakers clearly and without interruption. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome the 2020 Incomindios Lipuna Scholar, Brittany Orona. She is from the Hoopa Valley tribe in California, and she's a PhD candidate at the University of California, Davis. Her degree is in Native American Studies with a focus on human rights, and she's also an Indigenous and environmental rights activist. Brittany will be partnering with Incomindios and the University of Kent in the upcoming months, and we'd like you to watch her social media channels as you'll be hearing a lot more from her. So Brittany, can you please share a couple words about yourself?
Hey, Uncle Malia, Satiana Juan, the dead one on the Brittany Orona. So I am coming to you via Zoom from the unceded territories of the Nisenan, Maidu, and Miwok people in the Sacramento Valley in Northern California. So my work is centered on environmental justice, human rights, and visual sovereignty on the Klamath River. So I really look at how arts production and activism informs the way that tribal citizens are advocating against genocidal environmental projects that are continuing to this day. And I just want to thank Incomindios and University of Kent for both awarding me the scholarship and having me here today, as well as our speakers, Leandra, Cassandra, and Claudia, speaking about a really important topic that affects my community as well, and many communities across the Americas. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, Brittany. I'm now going to pass the Zoom platform over to Professor David Stirrup, who is a professor of American Literature and Indigenous Studies at the University of Kent and founder and director of the Center for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies, also on the board of Beyond the Spectacle here in the UK. And Professor Stirrup has been a long-time Indigenous scholar and advocate and does fantastic work in this field, and we are thrilled to partner with him and his center in the promotion of Indigenous rights more widely here in the UK and beyond. So Professor Stirrup, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. It's a real honor to be involved in this. As probably doesn't really need saying, MMIWG is such a devastating issue steeped in the deep legacies of colonialism. Indeed, as Alison Hargreaves argues, violence against Indigenous women is endemic to the existence of the modern colonial nation state itself. So as such, it's really incumbent, I think, on international authorities to engage with it, to be part of the means of addressing it, to bring further international pressure to bear on settler colonial governments, whose responses continue to be inadequate precisely because they can't or won't confront challenging questions about their own histories and even their own legitimacy. While that pressure will only ever be a small step in relation to the ongoing and systemic nature of settler colonial violence, it nevertheless helps to amplify the decolonizing anti-violence work of grassroots Indigenous activists. So the Centre for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies here at Kent was launched roughly a year ago. Our focus, unsurprisingly, is research and education, but our broader commitment is to public forms of both of those things. So at the centre of our mission are both the creation of platforms for Indigenous scholars and community members to speak in the UK, here at the heart of Empire, to ensure that Indigenous voices are both present and amplified within UK conversations about Indigenous issues, and to collaborate with Indigenous scholars and communities, as well as other non-higher education institutions, in order to develop the kinds of structures that ensure that work in the UK more closely aligns with the needs and expectations of Indigenous communities. Alongside that, we aim to generate resources and frameworks to facilitate teaching and understanding of Indigenous histories and contemporary concerns to both public audiences and at all levels of education in the UK. With all that in mind, our institutional partnership with Incomindios is really significant to us. Firstly, through the Lipuna Scholarship, but also through this and further planned work on MMIWG. Indigenous studies as a discipline has a clear and ethical responsibility to community. Working in the UK, it's not always clear what that responsibility looks like. Alongside active engagement with specific communities, then, collaboration with bodies like Incomindios, whose long-standing commitments to Indigenous rights has always included opportunities to Indigenous students to engage international audiences and valuable work experience, offers us the chance to build long-term ethical relationships built on principles of responsibility and reciprocity. As a literature scholar, I'm regularly reminded by the words of Indigenous scholars such as Linda Tihiwai Smith, Lee Maracle, Emma LaRocque and others about the relationship between the representation of and language used to describe Indigenous women in literature and the popular press and violence against them. Those same representations, of course, contribute to public apathy around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, contributing to their easy dismissal by settler authorities. It's a perfect vicious circle, and one of many reasons why it's so crucial that events that maximise the visibility of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and counter those damaging representations take place. So my huge thanks to the Incomindios team for arranging tonight's webinar. Before I hand over to the speakers, I just want to mention one forthcoming event. Alicia has already introduced you to our first Lipuna scholar, Brittany Arona. We are so excited about Brittany's work, and you should be too. She's going to be presenting a talk for us entitled "This is Our Home, This is Our Land, Visualizing Decolonization on the Klamath River Basin," that will take place via Zoom on December the 10th. So keep an eye both on our and Incomindios' social media for further information about that, which will be circulating in due course. And finally, to the real business, it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's first speaker, Leandra Nephin. Leandra is an Omaha tribal member and trauma psychotherapist working with survivors of sexual violence and domestic abuse. She's an international Indigenous public speaker, activist advocate, and blogger. Leandra is a board member for Incomindios UK, for the AHRC-funded project Beyond the Spectacle, Native North American Presence in Britain, and for the Omaha Tribal Historical Research Project, as well as being a student at the University of Oxford. I've known Leandra for several years now, and I genuinely still don't know how she does it. She's going to be talking to us about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the United States. So I'll hand over to Leandra now.
Uda watambade, umaha wa ubadi, umaha ijaje wiwitate, ambadagadi, wache ijaje wiwitate, Leandra, istashande wa ubadi. So I'm really glad to see everybody here, and I'm so glad that you've all decided to join us. I'll just translate what I've said in my Umaha language into English. So basically, I introduced myself as an Omaha woman. I'm an enrolled member of the Omaha tribe of Nebraska, and I grew up in the Omaha Indian Reservation, which is located in the northeast corner of Nebraska in the United States. When I think of my identity, it's very much tied to land. And so we're going to talk a little bit about land dispossession and how that relates, to MMIW. But one of the other things that I mentioned was my Omaha name, which is Ambadagadi, which means coming of a beautiful day. And I'm a Thunder Clan woman, and I belong to the Sky people. So at the minute, just to let you guys know, I have about 3 different screens because I'm trying to keep an eye on my PowerPoint slides and my presentation. So if it seems like I'm sort of looking in different areas, I do apologize. Maybe it's probably best if you just listen to what I have to say, might be a bit easier. Okay, so there's a lot of information to cover with regards to MMIW, and I'm conscious that you know, in the time constraints that we have for this webinar, that I'm more than likely not going to address every single topic. You know, there's so much more to MMIWG than we could discuss in a very short time, but I'm going to do my best, and I hope that if there are any questions that you put them into the chat box, and perhaps we can address those kind of at the end in our Q&A. So I'll just jump in and get started. So MMIWG stands for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This affects Indigenous peoples throughout Canada, the United States, and South America, and has resulted in a mass grassroots movement that is led by our women to raise awareness of this crisis that is impacting our communities. So it deserves to be stated that violence in general against Indigenous women and girls is not exclusive to the US and Canada. This is a worldwide assault that happens amongst many Indigenous communities throughout the world. But first, I want to acknowledge that whilst today we are centering the conversation on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, this is in no way diminishing the plight of our murdered Native men, LGBTQ, and Two-Spirit relatives. This is a conversation in which we're hoping to build upon and continue to work towards creating recognition and acknowledgement of this genocide that continues today through colonization, oppression, and land dispossession. You know, in my own family, we've had male relatives that have gone missing, and after years of searching, we had to eventually have them declared legally dead through the courts. And this was after a significant period of time where we were unable to locate or find them. It was like they just disappeared. They were gone one day. So my grandfather's brother was one of these, and he was homeless at the time and struggling with addiction, and was last seen in Chicago, but he was never heard from or seen again. So this is nothing new with Indigenous populations. This is something that has been an ongoing massacre against our people for over 500 years. And it goes right back to the time of European colonization of the Americas, with POCAhonty being one of the first documented cases of MMIWG. She was raped, she was trafficked, and then she eventually died here in England, where her remains are buried in the south of England in Gravesend, Kent. So today I want to try to give a brief overview of MMIWG. And when I say brief, there is a lot more to this discussion. And I hope that you, the audience, will have more of an understanding and a heightened awareness of the historical and contemporary inequities that Indigenous communities face. And really, I guess, for me personally, it was my way of doing something to highlight this issue, not only here in the UK, but more globally. It was my intention to create a movement here that would enact social change, almost as if to say to the United States and Canada and South America, the world is watching. You know, they're listening to these stories. What are you going to do to change? What are you going to do to enact social justice? And it was, I guess, my intention coming from that place, in the hopes that tonight, that what we all have to say might create more allies internationally to really bring this issue to the forefront. So there are several images and symbols that represent the MMIWG movement, which some of you may have seen or are familiar with. And this includes the red dresses. If we could, yep, thank you. And they are used to help honor, remember, and bring awareness to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So this was created in 2009. The red dresses they started actually as an art installation designed to draw attention to missing and murdered, to MMIW. It was a red dress project by Jamie Black in response to MMIW cases in Canada and the United States. And it continues to be an ongoing commemoration for First Nation, Inuit, Métis, and Native American communities. And what happens, they hang these empty red dresses in a range of different environments. So the project has also inspired other artists to use red, or the color red, to draw attention to the issue of MMIW. And it prompted the creation of Red Dress Day, which is May 5th. The color red is really become the official color of the hashtag MMIW or MMIWG campaign. But the color red actually has a deeper, significant cultural value that's attached to it. And for some tribes, red is known to be the only color that spirits see. And it's hoped that by wearing this color, we can call back those missing spirits of our women and children, and we can lay them to rest. So to start off with, before we get into that historical legacy that's contributed to the ongoing crisis, I want to highlight some statistics, which I'm grateful that Alicia mentioned a few statistics at the beginning related to MMIWG to show the extensive nature of the violence that is being perpetrated. So some of those statistics, if you could go to the next slide. Oh yeah, there's more about the red dresses. Oh, the handprint. We've got Rosalie Fish there. And statistics, that's great. So yeah, when it comes to Indigenous women, they're 10 times more likely to be killed than the average national murder rate. 4 out of 5 of our Native women are being affected by violence today. Homicide is the 3rd leading cause of death among Native women and girls aged 10 to 24 years old. 1 in 3 Native women is sexually assaulted during her lifetime, and 67% of these assaults are perpetrated by non-Natives. However, there's a caveat to that. In some reservations, the figure is much higher, with 96% of these sexual violence crimes being committed by non-Natives. I hope you guys can read some of those, which we'll go back to these statistics later on anyway. Indigenous women are between 3 and, sorry, did somebody say? No, I thought I heard somebody talking. Indigenous women are between 3 and 3.5 times more likely to be victims of violent crime than any other women. So while we represent about 2% of the US population, we have some of the highest rates of violence, incarceration, poverty, homelessness, suicide, and health disparities per capita in comparison to other populations. The rate of suicide is highest for Native American males. And due to a complex and tumultuous history in the United States, the resulting intergenerational trauma is really an important context for the discourse on mental health issues that are faced by Native American communities today. So there's literature that actually suggests that Native Americans are disproportionately suffering from mental health disorders. And these can include, but actually are not limited to, increased risk factors and prevalence for depression, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. When compared to the general US population, Native Americans experience PTSD more than twice as often and experience psychological distress 1.5 times more often than any other racial group. These experiences have major implications for suicide rates in Native American communities. Suicide has replaced homicide as the 2nd leading cause of death among US teenagers, and the highest rates among Native American youth. So these underlying risk factors really create vulnerabilities that contribute to further victimization and violence. So in order to understand how this has happened, we need to first understand the historical trauma that has contributed to the crisis of MMIWG. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, okay. So, just Just making sure my slides and screens are on track. So with the arrival of the European settlers in the Americas, native populations were forced to live on small tracts of land, which are known as reservations. And this was occurring as westward expansion and land theft occurred. So generally the pieces of land that where they were small, they were not suitable for farming or hunting. And it was part of the United States legislative policy to try and wipe out the indigenous populations that stood in the way of precious resources. And it was driven by this philosophy of manifest destiny. Could you go to the next slide, please? So the term manifest destiny was first coined in 1845, and it was used to justify the US territorial expansion that was occurring in the 19th century. It held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the continent of North America. And this colonization of our lands was rooted in the doctrine of discovery, which provided the framework for Christian explorers to lay claim to territories in the name of their sovereign, and these lands would be defined as discovered. And they would then set about Christianizing the indigenous populations. Can you go to the next slide, please? Thank you. As part of the assimilation process, many of our people were sent to boarding schools to try and kill the Indian and save the man. This was in line with, again, with the genocidal legislation to try and remove indigenous populations and really disconnect us from not only our lands, but our cultural ways and ceremonies. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So we can see how the difference between when they arrived and when they were indoctrinated into the system boarding. So we can quite clearly see the difference. If you can go to the next slide, please. This is a picture at Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which I had an opportunity to speak at to discuss some of my relatives that attended there. Along with, I think, Jacqueline Fear-Siegel, which I think I saw her name in here. So hopefully she's watching now. And so, yeah, so that's kind of showing some of the issues that were happening at the time. So this historical legacy of colonization, you know, is really what created this trauma. European colonization of our lands created this trauma. Indigenous children were sent to be acculturated into a Eurocentric way of living. Native families were coerced by the federal government and Catholic Church into sending their children to live and attend classes at boarding schools, which were often located far from their homelands. So arriving students would have their long hair cut short, English Christian names would be assigned to them, their traditional clothing would be replaced, their diets would change, and unfamiliar concepts of space and time would be enforced. So that they would be forbidden from ever speaking their native tongue and would be severely beaten if they did so. They would also be forced to let go of their cultural gender roles in favor of a white patriarchal construct. So for instance, Native women traditionally held important political, economic, and social power within communities. And even within my own community, we as Umaha are a patrilineal tribe, which means that we get our clanship through our father's line. But having said that, we still had a very strong matriarchy. Boarding schools disrupted the promotion of gender equality. That's really prominent amongst most of our people. Indian schools would force our women to adopt industrial and domestic skills appropriate to a European American standard. For many, this led to confusion, isolation, homesickness, and resentment. And this process of assimilation would cause irreparable psychological trauma to generations of Native American people. It was the goal of acculturation. It would be done by a total immersion into the white man's world. And with the advent of the Native American boarding schools, this process was fully accelerated through our children. So once these children grew up and returned to their home reservations, they would receive a mixed reception from their own people. Some would be really proud and happy they were able to attain a white man's education. I think this had more to do with their distrust of white people in general due to the loss of land through treaties they didn't understand. So for many, it became a point of survival to learn how to read and write English so as not to be taken advantage of again. And others, on the other hand, would not approve of the attempt to live as a white man or as a white woman. So many students returning home would become ashamed of their heritage and culture. And as such, they would find themselves almost kind of, sort of walking between these two worlds, oftentimes feeling unaccepted by either, unaccepted and not totally belonging in the white world, and at the same time, not totally belonging within their own tribal communities. So there were others, though, that did return home and completely rejected the educational experiences. And as the Indian schools would often say, return to the blanket. So I'd say that in quotes, but that just meant that this was a term that was used to describe an individual that returned to his tribal manners and dress. And they would cast off these white ways and completely return back to our traditional ways of living and ceremonies. That wasn't the experience for all, but it just kind of shows the multi-layered approaches to what was happening at that time. There were others that chose to stay completely immersed in the white society and would never return back home to their people. Christian missionaries and other persons of good moral character, I say that in quotations, were charged with civilizing Native children, often through physical and sexual violence. And so this really became a part of their lived experience. If you can go to the next slide. So it's showing some of the pictures from boarding school. And the next one. These are actually handcuffs that they used on children in boarding and residential schools. This was so a couple of pictures from my time at Carlisle. I was able to visit the school, and for me, this area was the area that really impacted me, to see so many graves of babies lost to imperialism, babies lost to colonization. Very, very difficult to be in that space. Next slide. So the impact basically of all of these things, the colonization, the loss of land, the forced removal onto reservations, boarding school trauma, these all had irreparable, psychological impacts. And this included, but obviously this isn't an exhaustive list. This isn't, I'm just naming a few. There's a lot of psychological trauma that happened. But some of these included loss of Native identity, loss of culture, drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues, depression, suicide, difficulty forming attachments, which is really an important tool to have when you're trying to form relationships. When you have issues with attachment, that really impacts your sense of self, it impacts your identity, especially for the Natives' identity. Our sense of self is determined by our relationship to our people, our relationship to others, our relationship to the cosmos and to the animals. And so when you have that detachment, it then goes back again to that loss of cultural identity. And again, kind of referring back to those other statistics earlier that I mentioned, around poverty, health disparities, suicide rates. So the earlier part of the 20th century was really a time of consolidating what little remained of our lands, of our language and culture. Many elders were cruelly beaten for speaking their native tongue, which resulted in a reluctancy to teach their children for fear of reprisals. So centuries-old societies and ceremonies that we had were lost or sometimes buried with our medicine people due to the devastating effects of successive waves of epidemics, with a large amount of our cultural treasures lost to foreign diseases. The US government constantly stood like a wolf at the door, ready and willing to abolish our tribal communities forever. This was a constant assault that we were fighting with each successive wave. Poverty, death, and disease became a way of life. You know, it was a really difficult, it was this kind of coerced dependency that resulted, where we had to rely on them even for food. Our farming and agricultural ways were taken away in some instances. In the mid-1940s, actually, can you go to the next slide? Sorry, go back. So in the 1940s, yeah, sorry, go on to the next slide, yeah. So in the mid-1940s and 1960s, there was the Indian Relocation Act. That was introduced to encourage Native Americans to leave their traditional lands again and reservations and relocate to cities and urban areas as a means to further continue that assimilation process, and really to detach them from their from the culture and society. It was part of the Indian termination policy, and it was used to coerce Native populations to continue to abandon their traditional way of life and become more civilized into a mainstream, and I say civilized in quotation marks, mainstream white Eurocentric population. Native Americans were not even classed as citizens of their own country until 1924, despite many of our people fighting in the wars for a country that saw them as merciless Indian savages. But this trauma doesn't end. It still continues today through our foster care systems. Many of our children are being adopted out to non-Native families. This again is creating systems of violence that allow further physical and sexual abuses to occur amongst our children, many of them running away, or falling prey to grooming, sexual exploitation, and coercion into sex work. And it's the federal colonial policies and laws that were created that create this kind of social setting for these crimes to continue. So while we are living in the same, well, I'm living in the UK, but in the United States, while our people are living in the same country, the worldview between the colonizer and the colonized are fundamentally distinct. So there's these very different perspectives on life. And if you go to the next slide. So this is a quote from a statement by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And they, you know, directly tie it back to this colonization period, that the high rates of violence against Native women and lack of accountability for such violence are clearly tied to federal intrusion, vulnerabilities created by such intrusion, and the failure to exercise authority to prosecute perpetrators for the last 500 years. So when we look at that historical context in relation to violence against Native people in general, we're able to see those links between institutional and structural racism as major contributing factors. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, leave it, yeah. So today, these policies continue to dehumanize our people, specifically women and girls, and support an infrastructure underlying the crisis of MMIW. So one of the key aspects of addressing this really requires reforms to the laws and policies that create social conditions to allow for this violence to continue to take place. So one of the questions that I often get asked when I speak about MMIW is, how is this still happening? How is this allowed to happen? Why is this happen? So not only have I mentioned the issues with trauma, intergenerational trauma, risk factors and vulnerability factors in relation to poverty, suicide, mental health issues, we've also got laws that are directly targeting us and have been directly targeting us, again, for over 500 years. And the reason that this is allowed to happen really has to come down to the jurisdictional relationships in the United States. So here in the UK, the government system is pretty straightforward. But in the United States, we have local governments, we've got tribal governments, state governments, and federal. And basically what's happening is where a crime is committed determines what jurisdiction that falls under. And there's a lot of miscommunication, lack of communication, and lack of established relationships between those governing entities. So and I'm putting it really, really simply. So for instance, if a Native person is murdered within reservation lands, that would go to federal jurisdiction, and the tribes are not allowed to do their own investigation. So if you could go to the next slide, I've got a jurisdictional cheat sheet, basically, which kind of outlines the complexity of this jurisdiction. This is one of the probably more complicated aspects of MMIW is around jurisdiction and reporting and investigating. So as I said, if a Native person is murdered within reservation lands, that would go to federal jurisdiction, and the tribes, like I said, can't do the investigation. That goes to federal. If a Native woman, for instance, is murdered off the reservation, it goes to state jurisdiction. So this creates confusion and cross communication. And the majority of times, it ends up being us looking for ourselves. There's a lot of grassroots organizations. For instance, Lissa Yellowbird Chase. She's a grassroots organization that is going out on her own looking for MMIW on the Fort Belknap Reservation. And so it's really us looking for each other, like I said, an issue with tribal sovereignty, and it creates issues in prosecution. So many of the cases that are not being prosecuted are also not being solved. And so Sovereign Bodies Institute is another organization. They're currently compiling a database to track missing and murdered Indigenous peoples. And perpetrators just in general are aware of these laws and how they favor the white patriarchal constructs. So our tribal courts are unable to persecute non-natives who commit crimes. And so really it's our women and girls who are being directly targeted because of these loopholes. I think on one of the slides previously back to the statistics, I don't know if you can go back really quickly. If you can see, 67% of those cases involved were not prosecuted, or they chose not to prosecute. So I'm conscious I've been talking a lot. And I'm just going to say really quickly as I go through this that it's really not just down to that, it's down to how we're being represented. If you go to the slide before, continue down to the next slide. Yeah, so we're one of the campaigns that we're involved in, we're looking at fighting Mascot's representation in the UK and how that's obviously there's literature tied to the impacts on our youth and community. Next slide. We've got POCAhonty, the hypersexualized images, dressing up in costumes that fetishize and exotify our women, which again is leading to MMIW. And then if you could go to the next slide. Despite this, we've got many women like us on the panel who are working to fight against this and address this. And legislatively, on the next slide, there is also Savannahs Act and the Not Invisible Act that has been passed in Congress just recently. It's gone through. So there's so much more to express on MMIW. I tried to do an overview and cover all of the aspects around it, but again, this is a conversation that we need to build upon. But I want to thank our non-Indigenous allies who provided space and platform for us to speak our truth. I work to create social change here in the European community, and my hope is that you continue to listen with openness and carry some of the messages that you've heard today into your own circles and further enact social change in your own spaces. And I carry these words with the good intentions in my heart and in my mind and in my words that I've spoken today. And I want to highlight a documentary that's coming up on November 3rd through BBC World Services that will address these issues in further depth that I would encourage all to listen to. So weave the hunt for listening. Again, apologies for running over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leandra, for that devastating, comprehensive, and illuminating talk, which provides such an excellent background for these cycles of oppression that underpin everything to do with MMIWG. This all began with colonialism. And I'm sure the audience may have questions for Leandra, and please don't be shy. Please feel free to use the chat box and put your question in now. And we will save them for the Q&A at the end. Right now, I'm delighted to introduce an amazing young woman named Cassandra Spade, who's also a dear friend of mine. Cassandra is a human rights and language activist from Mascot First Nations. I hope I said it right. And she has a BA from the University of Manitoba and currently doing a community economic and social development degree at Algoma University. She is passionate about Indigenous land-based education, the recognition of Indigenous languages as human rights, and developing an accessibility to education to Northern Indigenous communities and suicide prevention awareness. She's spoken at the United Nations in New York and Geneva, speaking for protection of languages and the promotion of Indigenous youth. And she's currently in the process of incorporating her own nonprofit to support Indigenous youth and their activism, which she'll be launching in the upcoming weeks in Canada. So without further ado, welcome, Cassandra.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to be here among so many beautiful people and very powerful women. So I'm going to be talking very much about my own lived experience and my personal connections to MMIW and relaying that to some very systemic and structural discrimination against Indigenous women in Canada. I will be using the term Indigenous to talk about Indigenous women in general. I will mostly be talking about the Anishinaabe women who are from the Great Lakes region in Ontario, and it kind of trickles around into the US as well. So first and foremost, there has not been a single year in my entire life where someone from my family, someone from my community, or one of my friends has gone missing, has been murdered, or has been taken by suicide. And I really want to highlight three very specific people in the last couple of years to talk about this. So in 2017, an Anishinaabe woman named Barbara Kenter was walking in the city of Thunder Bay. She was walking with several other Indigenous women. During that time, there was a young 18-year-old man who was non-Indigenous, and he decided he was going to have some fun that day and throw beer bottles at Indigenous women. However, when he saw Barbara, he decided to throw a trailer hitch. It resulted in her untimely death. Initially, he was charged with second-degree murder, but it has been downgraded over the years and continues to be downgraded. This is really showcasing how Indigenous women aren't part of the justice system and they aren't valued in the justice system. It also tells other Indigenous women in the area that their bodies don't matter and nor do their lives. In 2018, one of my childhood friends was murdered. And in that same year, very little news report was done. Very people reported her missing at the time. And when she was found, very little came of it. There was suspicion and investigation, but very little conclusion. In 2019, one of my closest friends took her life as the result of systemic structural discrimination of Canada's policies towards Indigenous women, resulting in internalized oppression and lateral violence. Her name was Kelly Frazier. And I talk about these women because they have brought so much light and love to my life and continue to do so. I really want to stress the importance of Indigenous women, why we value them, and what they mean to our communities. So Indigenous women in our communities, they're central to the livelihood, the diversity, and the protection of the lands around us. We have this concept called Kakina Kitinoendamen, which means that we are related to one another, or that we're interconnected to one another. This isn't just the idea that I'm connected to this person who is my family, my community member, or my relation. It's actually a much broader idea, in that Indigenous women are connected to the land that is around them, the plants, the wildlife, the biodiversity. An example of this is the relationship to water that Indigenous women have, particularly Anishinaabe women. This relationship is celebrating the spirit of the water, and it's a relationship of reciprocity, or of mutual giving and taking, and that the water is protecting the women and the women are protecting the water. So this idea of interconnectedness, is very much ingrained into Indigenous women. It's part of the way we view the world and the way we interact with the world. This is also represented when women are given this beautiful gift of bearing children, and that idea that they're carrying water for 9 months. So you may see a lot of Indigenous women around the Great Lakes region walking along the water. And it's a way to talk about that relationship and to make it really visible that Indigenous women are here, they're present, they're part of our communities, and very much valued. At the same time, when we talk about childbirth and birthing practices, Indigenous women carry very specific knowledge around medicine, about those traditional roles, and those gifts that they're passing on to their children. So this idea that women are this connection between the spiritual world and the real world, and that when a spirit is entering the woman, she becomes pregnant, she is kind of the vessel of all the good things about Indigenous communities. And she's going to transfer those things into her children. So she's going to transfer value, identity, language, culture, history, a multitude of things. And that is going to be really celebrated. One of the teachings that we learn from our elders is that when children are born, Indigenous women are meant to hold them very close in cradle boards, or what we call tikanagans, and they're supposed to repeatedly tell that child how much they love them. At the same time, in our worldview, we understand that children choose their mothers, that a child is recognizing the value in that Indigenous woman and choosing to be the child of that mother. So this is very much that idea that Indigenous women play central roles in our communities. They are valued. They recognize the importance of interconnection, so they're able to bring together communities. When you see thriving communities, you're going to see thriving Indigenous women in them. And we're also talking about the ecological diversity, or the health of the land, the health of the water, because Indigenous women understand the importance of this. So all that to say that Indigenous women are so much valuable, they're resilient, they're powerful, and very much a part of our communities, and we very much love them. We start to see really the beginnings of MMIW in the Confederation of Canada, which is in 1867. Several years later, there is this thing called the Indian Act in 1876 that's put into place. This act will be it will very much play a role throughout the rest of Canadian history and the impact on Indigenous women. Through this very discriminative act, it is setting structural and systemic policy that will undermine Indigenous women's leadership, their bodily autonomy, or they will be treated as property of men. It will also result in the displacement of women. So from the Act, 1876, when it starts, these things like residential school come into play, the 60 scoop, and these broader themes. Up until 1950, Indigenous women were not allowed to be leaders in their community. Because of this act, it only allowed men to be the chiefs, to be the heads of them. So it undermined Indigenous leadership up until that point. And we still see the impacts today. For example, in my community, which is 2/3 of Northern Ontario, or that geographic area, we have 49 Indigenous communities, and less than 25% of them have ever elected women into leadership. And this is the legacy of that Indian Act, saying that Indigenous women don't have leadership skills, they're not valued in positions of voice and advocacy, and has really continued that narrative throughout. Up until 1985, if an Indigenous woman were to marry a non-Indigenous man, she would no longer be allowed to live in her community and would be displaced. This is the result of something called status, or Indian status in Canada. So the Indian Act created this system of Indian status where the government imposed identity onto people and determined who could be Indigenous and who could not be Indigenous. So up until 1985, women were the property of men, meaning that if a non-Indigenous man married an Indigenous woman, she lost status, no longer Indigenous, couldn't live in her community, couldn't pass on that identity to her children, and was displaced from her community. So we see that this is really undermining Indigenous identity, language, our connections to one another, or that idea of interconnectedness, that kakinakitinoen damen. And we even see this piece of legislation still playing very much of a huge role in undermining Indigenous women today. In 2018, the Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau, made a statement that he recognized or acknowledged that there was a mass sterilization of Indigenous women in Canada. However, nothing has been done about it since. And it portrays that message that, you know, there are these problems, but we don't really care about them. Or that mass sterilization of Indigenous women doesn't really matter. It undermines the authority Indigenous women have on their bodies, but also sends this message that Indigenous women don't matter and their bodies don't matter, that you can do whatever you want with their bodies and no one's going to really care. And that's exactly what the Canadian government has stated by saying that. And without having any action, it really showcases this message that Indigenous women don't matter. So historically, we see that since the enactment of the Indian Act in 1876, through the undermining of Indigenous women and their leadership roles, to the displacement from their community, to the disconnection to their identity, and not being able to transfer those things into their children, to not even valuing Indigenous women's bodies, voices, or bodily autonomy. We see how these structural, systemic policies and acts undermine Indigenous women in every single way. It sends a very clear message to the broader public and the majority of Canadians as well. And in saying that, it very much is different to the way Indigenous communities see Indigenous women and the way Canada sees Indigenous women. I want to make it very clear that when Indigenous women go missing or when they're murdered, it's not just one person that's doing it. It's actually a whole structure and a system that is built and put in place to replicate that cycle. We start to see this in also a rising suicide epidemic that Leandra was touching on earlier, in that one individual suicide is an individual case. That's just a very random, singular decision. But when you start to see tens of thousands of people suiciding, it's actually an epidemic and can be a genocide at the result of systemic structural policies, such as the Indian Act. What the Indian Act really does is it undermines our self-value as Indigenous women. We start to internalize those oppressions, and we start to really embody what those dominant attitudes are thinking about us. We don't really see the value in who we are. We don't develop these strong self-esteems, and it results in, the statistics vary across the country, but in Canada, we have rates of suicide that are 5 to 6 times the national average. In my home territory, Indigenous women have 22 times higher than the national average, and some specific communities have 50 times the national average. The reason why we don't have a standard rate of the disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities is Canada still does not have a national suicide action plan. It has been passed through the House of Commons, but hasn't been implemented. So really, we're not entirely sure what the rates of suicide are. This is just an estimate because there is no accountability or tracking of suicide in Canada. However, the nation that I come from has been tracking suicide since 1986, and we have 49 communities with over 600 suicides, with children as young as 8 years old, particularly young girls. So I really want to stress that MMIW is about murdered and missing Indigenous women. It is not just a singular person doing this. And the rise of the suicide epidemic is a proponent of MMIW because it is at the hands of colonial, structural, discriminatory, bluntly racist policy that directly undermine Indigenous leadership, authority, value, voice, and the examples are endless, really. So part of what I do and my role is that I'm an advocate for creating space and pushing against those dominant narratives. So I really celebrate Indigenous women, Indigenous youth. I reconnect Indigenous youth to language, which is a huge part of what I do. So language revitalization. Currently, I'm working towards incorporating a nonprofit to do workshops and develop youth advocacy so that if there is a young person coming from a community and they're pushing back against all of these broader structural discriminatory policies, I'm able to support them in that way. And I'm also able to do it in a way that is inherently Indigenous through our languages, through our worldview and identity. So I guess the big point I want to talk about in MMIW is that Indigenous women have so much value, so much power, so much resilience, and are really pushing against these very violent, ugly, discriminatory, bluntly racist policies. And that it's not just singular individual acts, it's actually a structure or a system that is enacted and legalized to undermine Indigenous voice, Indigenous leadership, Indigenous bodies, Indigenous women in general. And that one of the solutions, or really the biggest pushback that I've found, is celebrating Indigenous women and supporting Indigenous-led initiatives or Indigenous-led projects, and really advocating as meaningful allies about protecting and preserving Indigenous identity, languages, and supporting Indigenous youth in a multitude of projects. So that's really what I wanted to talk about today. Miu, Namigwa. I'm very grateful to be here.
Hello, I'm having technical difficulties. Apologize. Thank you, Cassandra, for your beautiful presentation and your words of wisdom. I really, really enjoyed that. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Claudia Claros. She is a Bolivian lawyer specializing in Indigenous people's water rights. She has worked as a researcher for PEIRAV and CEJIS Bolivia. She's traveled extensively before settling in the UK, where she recently completed an MA in human rights focused on Latin America. And currently, she works for a charity providing refuge and support to victims of domestic violence. She's been involved in public speaking and social media communications for the charities that she works for and supports. And she's also a fellow board member with Incomindios UK. So Claudia, if you want to take it away next. Oh, I think you're on mute, Claudia.
Hello,
Oh,
thank
perfect.
you, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Today, I'm going to talk about the impact of the armed conflict in Colombia and how it has impacted negatively on Indigenous women. I'm going to start saying that without any doubt, the armed conflict in Colombia is exterminating the physical, cultural, organizational, and spiritual life of the Indigenous peoples, who are direct victims in this humanitarian crisis. The killing of Indigenous peoples, and especially Indigenous women, are a common event in the country. And despite the alarming numbers, the regional and national authorities are failing to take effective measures to protect and preserve the lives of Indigenous women. As a consequence of this government indifference is the armed groups who decide who lives and who dies in this ancestral territory. While there is an evidence that killings, extrajudicial executions, and other human rights violations are committed mainly against Indigenous men, Indigenous women have disproportionately experienced other types of violence, such as economic, sexual violence, and displacement. In Colombia, an Indigenous man is killed, but an Indigenous woman is tortured and sexually abused before she's assassinated. Colombia has, to give up an idea, Colombia has 115 Indigenous groups in their territory. 64 of them live in the Amazonia. And these 64 groups have specific characteristics and they are subject to special protection. These groups are guardians and they protect one of the most important areas of natural diversity in the planet. Therefore, they require special attention and care. Despite these characteristics, 34 of these groups are in danger of physical and cultural extinction. The constant violation of human rights and breaches of international humanitarian law, including the forced displacement caused for the armed conflict, has a disproportionate impact on Indigenous people's lives. The armed conflict affected Indigenous women differently than men in two main ways. They experienced higher levels of sexual violence and internal displacement. In areas where armed factors were present, sexual violence against Indigenous women and girls was widespread, including rape, forced prostitution, involuntary pregnancies, and forced abortions. This often led to a stigmatization and social rejection of women from their communities. In several cases, women had to abandon their customary lands to move to unfamiliar regions. Historic and enduring dynamics intensify the harms of gender violence for Indigenous women. Gender violence in the context of the armed conflict and its aftermath compromises a survivor's sense of identity in a number of ways. For example, the armed conflict and the territorialization process have curtailed cultural and traditional practices, including rituals and community gatherings, which will not go to the heart of the cultural identity and experience, but will also historically offer ways to process experiences such as violence and related feelings of grief and loss. The violence and its legacy have weakened the family relationships that connect people with ancestral territories and traditions. The combination of homicides, forced disappearances, sexual violence, massacres, and practices like dismemberment and violent deaths generate a fear and hopelessness, all of which constrain Indigenous women's sense of collective rights. Sexual violence impacts Indigenous women's sexual and reproductive rights, physical health, psychological and emotional and behavioral health. For example, in the aftermath of a sexual assault, an Indigenous woman will not return to a particular location because they were attacked there and are left feeling unsafe in their own territory. The other problem is the internal displacement. Greatly increases the insecurity and vulnerability of Indigenous women. Displaced Indigenous women assume a survival role, which differ from those they play in their own communities, such as providers of food. Displacement also ruptures links to Indigenous culture. including material and spiritual relationships to land. The cultural heritage is at considerable risk at most indigenous customs, including hunting, harvesting, and ceremonies that are practiced in community territories. Also, the unfamiliarity with livelihood options in other regions or cities is compounded, as most indigenous women are not fluent in Spanish. This leads to further deprivation, disorientation, and discrimination from her urban society, making indigenous women vulnerable to the informal labor market of prostitution. Unfortunately, the lack of reliable data on displaced indigenous peoples in urban centers results in unlimited specialized care and services, especially for indigenous women who have been displaced as a result of gender-based conflict-related violence. Adding to that, we have the high levels of impunity in conflict-related violence. Many survivors choose not to report assault for fear of retaliation from armed groups, but also because of a lack of confidence in the state, because regional judicial systems are not equipped to ensure comprehensive attention to indigenous women. For example, a judicial personnel often lacks knowledge of indigenous beliefs, codes, and traditional structures of justice, and many are unfamiliar with women's rights. And there is a general shortage of specialized healthcare and psychological support, as well as interpreters for non-Spanish speakers, all of which limits access to legal systems for indigenous women survivors of violence. Since 2016, the peace process has started in Colombia. And Colombia is experiencing the challenge of transitioning from war to peace. While the country is moving closer to peace, it cannot be described as post-conflict. The signing of the final peace agreement does not ensure sustainability and inclusive peace. And this is reflected in the continued high levels of economic, social, and political inequality, an abundance of armed groups, and resolved local level grievances, and the high level of local opposition to the peace process. I want to close this saying that core to the sustainability of the peace process is the ability of a broader society, including indigenous women's organizations, to meaningfully participate in the implementation of the peace agreement. Indigenous peoples in Colombia want a state that values indigenous knowledge and includes indigenous men and women, not as beneficiaries, but as decision makers. That will be the whole explanation of the last decades of the armed conflict in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia, for sharing your knowledge with us today. I appreciate everything you had to say. And again, thank you to Cassandra as well, to both of our speakers. Right, we'll just launch into the Q&A. So I see we've got a few questions in the chat. So I'll kind of go through this and try and get all of the questions answered. Right, so we'll start off first from Nayla. If a murder is inside the res police cannot do the investigation. It might be different in Canada, and perhaps Cassandra might be able to speak on that as well. Certainly in the United States, again, jurisdictional. So if a Native woman were to be murdered on the reservation, that investigation becomes property or becomes the responsibility of the federal jurisdiction. So the feds or the FBI would come down to the reservation, they'll work in conjunction, but they will be the ones doing the investigation. And so what's happening is for many families, or at least I don't want to speak too much on the families in my own community, because you know, that's their story to share. But you know, for instance, you know, it was our own people, kind of, you know, one of our women went missing, and her relatives basically went out searching for her. And so when I talked about the tribal police not having jurisdiction to investigate, it was left down to the federal or FBI to investigate those murder crimes. And as you could see from the statistics, that oftentimes FBI choose not to prosecute in the interest of the public. You know, again, white supremacy, settler, colonial mindset. A lot of these things happen. So for instance, they'll make judgments about the victim. Oh, she was drunk and she passed out and died in the freezing cold, or that it was down to the fact that she was a sex worker and you know, perhaps went off with one of her clients. So there's a lot of this kind of discrimination and stereotype that happens even within the police force, which I advocate for defunding the police. You know, and it's one of those things that goes back to representation. We experience relative invisibility. So how we are portrayed in media actually does have an impact. How we are portrayed as mascots or as costumes, that has an impact, because that filters down to police who are making judgments as judge, jury, and prosecutor. Unfortunately, that's the way the system and infrastructure is there, but it's specifically designed to target Native peoples purposely. So I hope I answered that. I don't know if Cassandra has any more to add to that at all in relation to Canada.
Yeah, I can quickly add. So when there is a murder or a death on an Indigenous community, it's the local police force does it. But in my specific territory, we're really unique because we have our own policing system compared to any other provinces. So Ontario, New Brunswick, and Quebec are kind of unique in having Indigenous policing. But what I want to say about the success of Indigenous policing is that we've never had any Indigenous police officer shoot or kill somebody while on the job. And whereas before, when we had the province policing our communities, we had like disproportional rates of violence between police officers and Indigenous people. So I want to make that very clear, and connecting that idea about defunding the police and supporting more organic community-led forms of justice and community care is essentially what it is. So murder and violence on reservations treated very much the same across the board in Canada.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the next question, Jacob Smith. So a question, Leandra, in your experience, what barriers are unique to developing awareness of MMIWG within the UK, and what could be done about these? I think barriers are, the biggest barrier would have to be representation. You know, like I mentioned in my presentation, we represent about less than 2% of the population in the United States. So if you imagine representation here in the United Kingdom, it's even less. Our community, or our group of natives who live here in the UK make up, so currently there's only about 13 or 14 of us. So when you're tackling issues like MMIWG, that is an issue that when I first started doing this work over here, many people didn't know anything about it. It was like America and Canada's biggest open secret. So there was a lot of work that needed to be done. I think more recently, BBC, The Guardian, they're starting to highlight this issue more and more. So I guess for me, the barrier would be lack of education of Britain's colonial legacy in relation to the Americas. You know, Britain's part that they played in that, because that's not being taught in the schools over here, and our representation in media portrayals, and the use of our image in sports mascots, how we're represented. So there's just overall a general lack of education, which I think really needs to happen in schools. Ideally, I would like to see it in primary schools, but secondary schools for sure, because there's just no education around Native peoples, with many of the people that I come across not even realizing that we still exist. So I would say that's the major barrier for me personally. Okay, next question. Nayla, she's the editor of a journal. Yeah, I guess we could probably talk about that later. She wants copies of the photos, cover the topic. We'll talk, yeah. Nayla, I'm on all social media platforms, and I'm sure if you contact Incomindios, they can provide my email and everything.
Then sorry, Leandra, just sorry to interrupt you real quick. For anyone who has personal inquiries, if they want to contact Claudia or Leandra, I mean, as Leandra said, you can find her on all her social media platforms. But also with Cassandra, just please drop us a line, and we will connect you with Cass and Claudia. They'll respond. So any personal inquiries, please send it to inco.uk@incomindios.ch. We'll have all of our Twitter, social media handles up on the slide at the end of the talk. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Thank you for clarifying that. So I hope that helps, Nayla. Okay. Jacqueline Fear-Seagull, I wonder if you could say how much in advance you think the new legislation represents, Not Invisible and Savannahs Act. How will they help? And can changes at federal level bring the most profound changes, and by extension, having more Native women in Washington? Yes. Actually, I wonder if Danny is able to put that slide up of Savannahs Act and Not Invisible Act. Is that possible at all? So both of these acts are increasing that cross communication. So in the BBC World Services documentary that's going to be released on November 3rd, they actually talk about that and how it's creating these better partnerships, better collaborations, so that there aren't these kind of cases that are falling through the system. So if you look at that slide, it kind of talks about addressing some of the issues that we are facing as to why this is such a problem in the United States. Federal level, I think one of the things that they are looking to do that I've heard just recently is to establish a federal database in relation with or in conjunction with, I could be wrong, so don't quote me, Sovereign Bodies Institute. So Anita Lucchese is got the MMIWG database, and she's been tracking that. And I think that they're looking at tracking and accurately identifying those who have gone missing and murdered. And I think, yes, on one hand, it would create the most profound change in the hopes that it would trickle down to state and local level, but I'm in agreement with Cassandra as far as community-driven networks and support services and things like that. But at the minute we are having to politicize this, and having Native women in Washington is obviously going to massively help our case and work towards creating change with this. There's VAWA that's due to be reauthorized. So there's a lot of people working, a lot of women working behind the scenes to make this happen. So I hope that answers your question. But yeah, if you have a look at both of those, that kind of fills in the gaps as to what that's hoping to accomplish. Thank you so much for your presentation. In light of the election coming up next week in the US, can you comment on the difference of results with each of the leaders? That's actually not my area of expertise. I'm not a fan of of either of them. So I probably wouldn't give a comment that would possibly even be helpful in that. If you want to type specifically what you're asking but to be fair, I'm not a supporter of either of them, Biden or Trump. do you think that cultural appropriation of Indigenous culture and women shown by non-Indigenous people in countries like the UK is due to ignorance or subconscious, or in some cases, conscious colonial attitudes? Both. I would say it's down to both. I've had instances where in the activist work that I do here, where it is very clearly an education issue, where it's just not taught, they're not aware, they just don't know. And, you know, social cues that are being saturated in society are kind of stunting these social interactions that we're having. So they see me kind of in this historical context or as a mythologized figure. So yes, on one hand, there are people I come across where it is generally down to lack of awareness, education, but there are also those more recently that we've had, because we're involved, I'm actually involved in a campaign, Exeter Chiefs for Change, looking to change the native imagery and branding of Exeter Rugby Club. And they, I would say, are very informed about how offensive this information is, and, you know, are definitely, I guess, digging their heels in, and just really highlights that kind of racial hierarchy and hegemony that kind of comes into play, and it's quite willful. So I think that's probably going to be indicative of most societies, you know, racism in general. So yeah, to answer your question shortly, I think it's both. Hi, why has the problem been not so much articulated in the USA? What I mean is that every book about Canadian Indians may have a chapter about this problem, and the Canadian artists you presented are well known, whereas in the US, not so much. Am I right? Can you recommend good literature? Yeah, I mean, I kind of addressed this at the beginning. It's, you know, of these questions, you know, where it's this kind of big open secret. I think Canada is doing better than the US as far as tackling this issue, but there's still, you know, systemic issues that need to be improved upon. I think if you're involved in if you look at hashtag MMIW or hashtag MMIWG, there are a lot of resources out there and available. Because I'm sort of quite involved in this world, to me, it seems like there are a number of resources that are available that are highlighting this in the US. So some of those I could recommend is Sarah Deer's work. So that's Sarah and Deer, like the animal, D-E-E-R. She is amazing. Her books and her work on this issue, I would recommend. I would, again, like I said, recommend, you know, just doing a simple Google search into hashtag MMIW, or even on all social media platforms. There's a few books which I wish I had to hand. Conquest is another book, but I can't think of it offhand. But if you want to email me, I can give you a whole list of resources to help you out with this. So if you contact us in some way, I can give those resources to you. So Leandra, what makes you live in the UK? You don't miss your traditional land. Is life as an Indigenous woman in the UK better than the US? My husband's British. I moved over here and I wanted to see what was out there, what was the rest of, you know, to explore the rest of the world. I do miss my traditional land. My whole family are back home on the reservation, and I go back often to, as much as I can, actually. I try to go back every year. This year I wasn't able to because of COVID. But my identity, I mean, it's the land that raised me. We were quite fortunate, the Omaha people, in that we maintained our ancestral land, so we weren't relocated. And yeah, I did a lot of hunting, fishing. So the first place I go when I go home is the water, Missouri River. We are located on the Missouri River. So yeah, I would know. I wouldn't say Indigenous women in the UK is better than the US. I mean, if you're thinking in terms of MMIW, I guess it would be safer because obviously they're being targeted at high rates. But I miss home, and I look forward to moving back to work amongst my people, like I said, as a therapist. Right, so there's a lot of questions here. I want to get to some, just ask one of these questions for Cassandra really quickly, and then we might have to start addressing these in a follow-up special.
If I could interject, I think a great question for all three of us to answer would be, how do you support Indigenous-led initiatives, or how to incorporate like the awareness about MMIW? And I think we were all each touching on understanding your role in colonialism, because each of us has a role. You know, it's a global phenomenon. It doesn't just happen in Canada or Colombia or the United States. It happens everywhere. So really trying to look at your surrounding area and asking your questions of like, are there Indigenous people here? What is my country's role in this? And then how do I support other activists? I think hugely amplifying grassroots voices, because we are direct in our community and have huge impacts in our community. For example, this year was the first year that I ever established, or I should say my community ever established, a book club, which is about Indigenous resilience and talking about literature with children. And we are also campaigning to have a month-long of celebrating our local language. So yeah, really making those like personal connections. It's not just about like taking off boxes saying, oh, I have this diversity here. It's Incomindios does a really great job of creating that meaningful relationship, and I really am thankful for their friendship. I don't know if Claudia, you could add to that.
Yes, I think it was a pleasure to raise awareness about the Indigenous communities in the whole world, in Latin America, in America. We have the same different territories, but we have the same core and the same struggles. So Incomindios is an amazing platform to raise awareness and debate and open debate with people who is not in the media, who doesn't know much about it. So I think it's a great idea to just do webinars and have a wide platform now. Yeah.
Thank you, Claudia. I think, so yeah, there's a lot of questions I think Jacob's put into the chat that we'll try to go through and do a follow-up special and answer all of these questions, because there are so many. But if I could now turn it over to Alicia. Thank you, Cassandra. Thank you, Claudia, for joining us. And I hope you all enjoyed our speakers today. Alicia?
Yes, a massive, massive thank you to our phenomenal panelists. I found that incredibly illuminating and just really powerful. And also thank you everyone for your excellent questions. We were worried at the beginning that we wouldn't get enough questions, and now we are completely overloaded. So as Cassandra and Leandra said, we want to be able to answer every single one of your questions, and we're going to try to figure out how to work that out in a format that will be available on social media in the coming days. So, and I also just want to reiterate that Incomindios is not a voice for the voiceless. We want to, of course, amplify Indigenous voices, but we want to pass the mic. We want to curate spaces where there's equal partnership and where Indigenous women are highlighted and they are taking up space, that they are speaking their truth, and we're not speaking for them, they are speaking for themselves. And just to create more spaces like this, and where Indigenous and non-Indigenous exchange is happening. So if you have any other further questions, please email us. Yes, thank you, Danny put up the slide there. You can send us a direct email to inco.uk@incomindios.ch. And also you can DM at any of the Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter feeds. Please also look at the excellent work that the University of Kent, that Professor Stirrup, his Center for Indigenous and Settler Colonial Studies, is running. Also the social media there. The link to his website is located on the right-hand side, and also his Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for his center is there as well. So otherwise, I want to thank you all for listening and joining in, for bringing your questions to the table. And may we continue to raise awareness and shine light on this to see an end to this cycle of violence, which requires not only awareness, but decolonization, massive laws and policy change from grassroots to federal level, and new initiatives to promote and empower Indigenous women. Again, a massive, massive thank you to our panelists for your impactful and inspiring words, and also just the work and preparation you did. And for Professor Stirrup at the University of Kent and his center, and Brittany Arona, we are really excited for the future projects with you. And finally, a special thank you to Jacob Smith and Danny Payne, who are phenomenal social media and communications coordinators. They've just done an outstanding job helping coordinate this, putting everything together, as well as the outreach. If you would like to partner with us, please, like I said, send us an email, whether individually or an organization or institution. As you see all the information up on the slide, and you can also visit our website at incomindios.ch/en. So we hope that you will join us again in the near future. This will be one of many webinars and campaigns. So thank you again for everyone that participated. We really appreciate your listening, and there's so much more work still to do. So thank you very much, and have a great evening.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you all. Take care. See you later.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.